As soon as humankind was able to walk, men and women travelled. Our ability to put one foot in front of the other and our determination to do so is one of the most important drivers of human history. And so the great 10th century Arab traveller Abu al-Hasan Ali ibn al-Hussein al-Masudi is a wonderful vehicle for us to get around during the Islamic Golden Age, that is, covering the years from 750 to roughly 1250, and to become better acquainted with history. This wise Arab scholar, who is almost always referred to simply as al-Masudi, once stated the following: "He who has never left his hearth and has confined his researches to the narrow field of the history of his own country cannot be compared to the courageous traveller who has worn out his life in journeys of exploration to distant parts, and each day has faced danger in order to persevere in excavating the mines of learning and in snatching precious fragments of the past from oblivion." In his own lifetime, and over the course of the 5th-century Islamic Golden Age, al-Masudi was among a host of travellers across the Muslim Middle East who wrote detailed accounts of their journeys. Numerous historians were also active during the period, so it's important for me to say why I'm focusing on al-Masudi in particular. Well, for one thing, al-Masudi travelled further than any of his near contemporaries. Indeed, he is often referred to as the Arab Herodotus, after the ancient Greek historian and wayfarer. And for another, al-Masudi, like Herodotus, broke the mould in terms of how he wrote about the world and its peoples and its past. Al-Masudi's travels took him beyond the Abbasid heartland into Persia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and other lands around the Caspian Sea. He saw parts of northern and western India, travelled extensively in and around the Arabian Peninsula, and east to Africa, including Madagascar, as well as to Syria and Egypt. Beyond this pretty impressive checklist, he also writes about Sri Lanka, Sumatra in modern-day Indonesia, Malacca in Malaysia, and further east into China. Scholars are divided on whether or not he actually visited these last few countries, or whether perhaps he relied on the descriptions of fellow travellers. But al-Masudi himself says in his masterpiece, The Meadows of Gold and Mines of Gems, which is a historical account of the beginning of the world from the time of Adam and Eve up to medieval Baghdad, that "I have reviewed every century together with the events and deeds which have marked it, up until the present. Furthermore, there is to be found a description of the seas and continents, of lands inhabited and uninhabited, of the lives of foreign kings, their histories, and those of all the different peoples. If God gives me life, if he extends my days, and grants me the favour of continuing in this world, I will follow this book with another, which will contain information and facts on all kinds of interesting subjects. Without limiting myself to any particular order or method of setting them down, I will include all sorts of useful information and curious tales, just as they spring to mind." Alas, the promised sequel was not to be. Even so, his approach to writing about world history and geography would influence generations of scholars, including later Islamic scholars who almost literally would walk in his footsteps, including Ibn Battuta and Ibn Khaldun in the 14th century. And even among modern historians, al-Masudi's work remains one of the best available geographical and historical sources on the early medieval world. According to the British historian Hugh Kennedy, Meadows of Gold is probably the best introduction to the Arabic historical tradition for the non-specialist. And in this lecture, I'm going to discuss the life and times of al-Masudi during the Islamic Golden Age, starting with a couple of questions about possible reasons for his decision to leave his home, and what we can discern about the man from his writings. After that, we'll look at how he may have supported his travels and how his professional interests fed into the subjects he wrote on. Born in Baghdad in 896, al-Masudi set off on his travels in about the year 916, when he would have been just 20. He would be on the road for the next 30 years. Now, the ruling Muslim dynasty of Sunni Abbasids, which was based in Baghdad, had by then lost great chunks of its empire to various competing powers. Also, the idea of a united caliphate, that is, one religious and temporal power to rule the entire Muslim world, was by this time a vanished dream. The Abbasids had already lost power and influence in Andalusia, or the Iberian Peninsula today, as well as in much of North Africa, and in parts of neighbouring Persia, southern Mesopotamia, which today we call Iraq. One practical result of this was the rise of rival centres of intellectual and cultural development, and commercial trade, going beyond Baghdad, in such emerging centres as Cairo, Cordoba, and elsewhere. That might have prompted the young al-Masudi to think that if he was going to realise his ambitions, he would have to travel outside of Baghdad. At the same time, reliable knowledge about these independent and semi-independent outlying lands was harder to get than it had been in the now distant days of the united Umayyad Caliphate, before the Abbasids overthrew them in 750. Thus, if you really wanted to understand the world beyond your homeland, you had to go there yourself and acquire accurate, first-hand information through personal encounters. Not that travelling is always easy or fun. Like the protagonist in Oh, the Places You'll Go, Dr. Seuss's classic book for children and university graduates, the start of al-Masudi's journey was a case of congratulations, today is your day, you're off to great places, you're off and away. You have brains in your head, you have feet in your shoes, you can steer yourself any direction you choose. With that, I think we're ready to embark upon a storied review of al-Masudi's journeys and what he wrote about them. As we do so, we'll see the ways in which his approach was new and distinct from that of his predecessors, as well as how his travels contributed to the development of his approach to the study of history. So to begin, what was the significance of geography in the Muslim Middle East up to al-Masudi's day? And secondly, what was the role and importance of history for early Muslim authors? An answer to these questions begins with the statement that there exists in the Islamic faith an obligation to perform the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca, at least once in one's lifetime. That is, if one is healthy enough and has the financial means to undertake the journey. Speaking more practically, this religious duty, along with the expanding Muslim empire, meant that as that empire grew through the 7th and 8th centuries, a need also grew at the centre for more information about these recently conquered lands. The Baghdad-based empire's administrators and the large merchant class, which was as keen as ever to find and open new markets in which they could trade, relied on such knowledge to meet their professional needs. Now, I have no doubt that the growth and enduring popularity of adventure and travel literature in the Middle East is one piece of evidence for this. The tales of Sinbad the Sailor, complete with shipwrecks, encounters with genies, and other dangerous adventures, are but one example in the Arabic literary tradition that many readers in the West are familiar with, and there are many. Now, what's the point of history? Specifically, what was the role and importance of history in the first 300 years of Islamic history? This period starts with Muhammad's death in 632 and runs through the Rashidun, that is, his first 4 successors, onto the Damascus-based Umayyad Caliphate and the first century and a half of the Abbasid Caliphate, until the start of al-Masudi's journeys around the year 920. In early Muslim times, history played two roles. The first was to share the story of Muhammad's revelations, including the formation of the Muslim community and its territorial conquests. And secondly, and much less importantly, to relate the genealogical history of tribes and tribal administration. The tribal histories consisted in large part of genealogies, that is, long lists of names that could be used as evidence of what tribe had land or inheritance right. Not dissimilar to the lengthy genealogies one finds in the Old Testament, notably in Genesis. These lists of who begat whom are obviously very important for the tribes concerned, but they don't make very dynamic history. The typically heroic deeds of great men who form a tribe's past are, on the other hand, extremely dynamic, if not always historically accurate, or at least not verifiable. Now, in early Islamic history, the story of Muhammad, his revelations, and the spread of Islam during his lifetime and in the years immediately after his death in 632, was by far the more important form of history. It was important for the religious legitimacy that Islam claimed for itself, and for the legitimacy of the caliphs, that is, Muhammad's earthly successors, whose personal claims to imperial legitimacy depended on being in line with the religious claims. Now, like other medieval historians before him, al-Masudi offered a history of the world from the creation to his own day. But, unlike virtually all of those who came before him, he made this come alive with a glorious array of really entertaining stories. He included numerous asides and anecdotes, some more gossipy than others. Al-Masudi presented a record of Muhammad's life, as well as some aspects of Christianity and the pre-Muslim era in Arab lands, as part of his writings. But while all the evidence suggests that he was a devout Muslim, he did not see it as necessary to condemn different faiths out of hand. Rather, he comes across, even today, as confident, not conceited. And he writes for factual accuracy, not polemics. Coupled with this, al-Masudi was also honest when writing about places that he hadn't visited, i.e., when he cited other sources that he considered reliable. So now let's look a little more closely at what sort of things al-Masudi wrote about. For one, he was interested in geography, geology, and mineralogy. He wrote a great deal about precious and semi-precious stones, a fact that has led some to speculate, not unreasonably, that perhaps buying and selling of minerals was one way in which he made a living while he travelled. Knowledge of such matters would be useful to an individual looking to make money from trading precious stones. Al-Masudi also provides a natural history of the elephant and a description of a royal feast, as well as any number of tragic love stories, including a description of Cleopatra's death. For our first example of a specific geographical entry from his magnum opus, I'd like to go to Northern Europe. Although he didn't travel there himself, what he wrote about the northern lands was both accurate for its time and still inherently interesting. For instance, al-Masudi relates that those who have travelled that far north reported the inhabited area extends from the equator as far north as Thule, beyond Britain, and there the longest day lasts for 20 hours. Now, the reference to the imaginary land of Thule uses the Greek term for Europe's northern extremities. The place name might be a Greek invention, but there are a number of inhabited places in Northern Europe that have 20 hours of daylight in midsummer, including Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and the Norwegian city of Trondheim. Al-Masudi himself writes, "As regards the people for whom the sun is distant from the zenith, those who penetrate to the north, such as the Slavs, the Franks, or French, and those nations that are their neighbours. The power of the sun is weak among them because of their distance from it. Cold and damp prevail in their regions, and snow and ice follow one another in endless succession. The warm humour is lacking among them, their bodies are large, their natures gross, their manners harsh, their understanding dull, and their tongues heavy. Charming, I must say, speaking as a Northern European. However, let's remember that he's talking about the 10th century here, a time when the Norsemen who'd settled in France were becoming the Normans, when a united England was still emerging, and the British Isles were being both attacked and settled by the Vikings. Indeed, as remote as mid-Scandinavian settlements might have been at the time when al-Masudi was writing, in the mid-10th century we know that the Vikings who lived there were actively raiding and trading with the outside world. In short, this wasn't a period of cultural greatness in Northern Europe. That would come later. The late medieval historian of technology, Dr. Lynn White, wrote that, "To the modern eye, this time in Europe is very nearly the darkest of the Dark Ages," adding, "But if it was dark, it was the darkness of the womb." In other words, while it might have been dark, there was nevertheless something growing just out of sight. The way I view this is that it was important for al-Masudi to understand the great civilizations that came before Islam and those that existed out of it. This in itself set him apart from many of his predecessors. By way of comparison, many Islamic scholars working in the exciting days immediately after the rise of this new Muslim world power saw little of importance in those earlier, now defunct cultures. Al-Masudi, however, was quite interested in 7 different ancient pre-Islamic cultures that he saw as having important histories to tell. These were the Persians, Chaldeans, Greeks, Egyptians, Turks, Chinese, and Indians. The Chaldeans, situated in southeastern Mesopotamia, or modern Iraq, beginning in about 800 BC and emerging as the rulers of Babylonia from 625 BC to 539 BC, were notably led by the warrior king Nebuchadnezzar II, who sought to have no opponent from horizon to sky, and who drew comparisons much later to Napoleon. It's noteworthy that after more than 1,000 years after al-Masudi was writing, of these 7 civilizations, only the Chaldeans have largely slipped from the popular imagination. Al-Masudi's account of his travels in the world are largely free of the more fantastic observations and stories which the father of history regales his readers. For the most part, he leaves fantasies and fables to other writers. He's a searcher after cold, hard facts, which isn't to say he doesn't make educated guesses from time to time. For instance, when he's in Egypt, al-Masudi asks locals about the pyramids, which were ancient even in his own times, having been constructed thousands of years earlier. Al-Masudi observes that these massive structures were built in a remarkable way. Their sides are covered in all kinds of inscriptions, written in the scripts of ancient nations and of kingdoms that can no longer exist. No one can read this writing or know what was intended by it. I should point out that many of these inscriptions have since been deciphered, although not until 1,000 years after al-Masudi visited Egypt. Al-Masudi goes on to write that, "I have questioned the learned Copts of Upper Egypt and other provinces on the meaning of the word Pharaoh, but no one has been able to tell me anything about it, for this name does not exist in their language. Perhaps," Al-Masudi concludes, "originally it was the title for all their kings." I think that there are 2 things to note here. One, he's obviously happy to accept knowledge, if possible, from the Copts, Egypt's indigenous Christian population. What al-Masudi understands is that the locals are likely to know more about their own country and what's in it than he, the foreign visitor, does. To put it another way, he's not concerned with the non-Muslim religious beliefs of some of his informants. And in this way, he is largely free of the sort of prejudice that many writers from the period exhibit. The best descriptor of his view of other religions, monotheistic or otherwise, is curiosity. The second thing to note is that his speculation about the title pharaoh is spot on. It was indeed the general title for the kings of ancient Egypt. A final example I'll offer you of al-Masudi's broad range of interests is in the following extract from Meadows of Gold, where he talks about the ancient game of backgammon, in which two players compete to move their counters around and off the playing board, with moves decided by rolling a pair of dice. Characteristically, once al-Masudi spoke with people who knew more about the subject than he does. Rather than incorporate a bland statement of facts, he will record opinions. And whether you're a backgammon player or not, it's fascinating to see the prevailing opinion of the game's deeper meaning. Al-Masudi writes, "It was at this time that backgammon was invented and began to be popular. It is a kind of paradigm of how wealth is acquired, which in this world is not the reward of intelligence or ability, just as luck is not a product of skill. If luck favors the player, he gets what he wants. If it doesn't, a skilled and prudent man cannot win that which fortune only bestows on whom it likes. It is thus that the good things of this world are apportioned by chance." Well, even in his own day, al-Masudi was important for the shift he brought about in how history was, or could be, written. Gone were the slavish lists of names and the unexamined tales of mythical beasts and faraway lands. Here, instead, was a first-hand account of the world as seen through the eyes of a reliable and trustworthy chronicler. This intellectual innovation was largely responsible for the reinvention of the historical method in the Muslim world. Now, rather than an historian of Islam, al-Masudi is a Muslim historian. It would be interesting to know exactly how he financed his long years of globe-trotting, but we don't. Although it's possible he's more personal in other works that haven't survived, we wouldn't be stretching the bounds of reason to hazard a guess that al-Masudi was an enterprising merchant as well as an interested and scholarly traveller. That would certainly offer a practical explanation for his travels, and would explain how he could afford his sojourns, and perhaps explain why he seems more interested in so many matters that previous Muslim historians had neglected. Al-Masudi ended up spending about a decade in Cairo until his death in 956 at the age of 60. It was during these years that he wrote the 30 volumes that make up the Meadows of Gold. As al-Masudi says near the end of his magnum opus, "The information gathered here is the fruit of long years of research and painful efforts of voyages and journeys across the East and the West, and of the various nations that lie beyond the regions of Islam. The author of this work compares himself to a man who, having found pearls of all kinds and colours, and gathers them together into a necklace and makes them into an ornament that its possessor guards with great care. My aim has been to trace the lands and the histories of many peoples, and I have no other." The importance of al-Masudi's new approach to writing history was still in evidence in the Muslim Middle East 400 years after his lifetime, when he was cited by one of the greatest historians of any age, Ibn Khaldun, the 14th century Tunisian. In many ways, Ibn Khaldun was al-Masudi's natural successor in terms of his approach to writing history. And in his own masterpiece, the Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun acknowledged the debt he owed to al-Masudi, stating, in part, "History consists of the recording of the particular events of an era or a generation. The general conditions of faraway places, generations and eras constitute a basis for the historian on which most of his objectives are built and according to which his reports are classified. Al-Masudi explained the conditions of nations and faraway places both east and west, down to his own days. He mentioned their creeds and customs, described countries, mountains, seas, kingdoms and states, and distinguished Arab from non-Arab nations. He thus became an imam, or a model, for historians who refer to him, and a source upon which they depend to verify many of their reports." As al-Masudi recognized, it's our ability to put one foot in front of the other, and our determination to do so, that drive human history.